Imagine an obscure young woman living in late 19th century France,
Right.
and she died at just 24 years old, having spent the last 9 years of her life entirely hidden away,
Hmm.
like behind the thick stone walls of a cloistered convent.
Completely cut off from the world.
Exactly. I mean,
Oh.
she didn't invent a new technology. She didn't lead an army or draft legislation or run a country.
No.
Yet her personal handwritten memories, which were, just scribbled in these cheap school copybooks during her final, honestly agonizing illness, they completely revolutionized modern spirituality.
It really remains one of the most stunning paradoxes in, historical theology, right? You
Yeah.
have the ultimate hidden life, yet it produces this intensely public, like universally applicable legacy.
Yeah, and that's why today we're taking a deep dive into the mind of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. And if you're listening to this and you follow this space, you probably already know the basic biography,
Sure, the standard outline.
right? She wrote Story of the Soul, and, she died young in Carmel. But today
Hmm.
we're bypassing that sanitized, statue holding roses version of her life.
We have to.
Yeah, because we've got a fascinating stack of sources in front of us. We're looking at her original, unedited autobiography, some historical analyses of 19th century French Catholicism, and this is the really interesting part, several modern psychological evaluations of her early childhood trauma.
Which is so crucial to understanding her.
Exactly. Our mission is to trace the evolution of her revolutionary concept, which is known as the little way. We really want to understand how a highly sensitive, deeply traumatized child forged a framework of thought that is so enduring and radical, and surprisingly applicable to modern psychological resilience.
Yeah, and to do that, it requires us to treat this not as some dusty, pious relic, but as a brilliant and frankly harrowing psychological journey. Therese didn't just discover the little way in a vacuum.
Right. She didn't just wake up one day enlightened.
No, not at all. She took the raw, chaotic materials of her own emotional fragility and, she essentially engineered a profoundly subversive philosophy.
Okay, so let's unpack that psychological baseline.
Yeah,
Because to understand the cure, we have to deeply understand the underlying condition, right?
absolutely.
So we're starting in the French town of Alençon. In her writings, Thérèse describes her early childhood as sunny. And reading the family letters in our sources, she was incredibly precocious, like intensely lively and fiercely stubborn.
That stubbornness, that is a crucial psychological marker.
Really? How so?
Well, while her older sisters and her parents sometimes viewed her intense willfulness as a behavioral flaw to be managed, it's the exact trait she weaponized later in life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she had this immense enveloping foundation of love. Her parents, Louis and Zélie, absolutely doted on her. She was the youngest, the baby of the family, and she possessed a powerful sense of self-worth from day one.
But then we hit what she calls the Great Rupture. When Thérèse is 4.5 years old, her mother dies of breast cancer. And the sources detail how the family uproots from Alençon and moves to Les Buissonnets in Lisieux. And I want to linger on this because we often just read, her mother died as a timeline event.
Just a bullet point.
Right. But psychologically, for a child whose brain is in that specific stage of development, what actually happens when that foundational pillar vanishes?
It is a catastrophic abandonment trauma. At 4.5, a child's entire concept of safety and object permanence is completely tied to the primary caregiver.
So her whole world just collapses.
Completely. When Zélie dies, Thérèse's nervous system essentially goes into a permanent state of hypervigilance. That sunny, confident toddler just vanishes overnight.
She writes that the winter of trial began.
Yes. And the psychological evaluations in our sources point out that she essentially lost her emotional epidermis. She became excessively timid, hypersensitive, and prone to endless loops of crying over the most microscopic perceived slights.
Yeah, she writes about crying and then weeping out of guilt because she was crying.
It's terrible.
It's an exhausting emotional spiral. And she copes by latching onto her older sister, Pauline, explicitly declaring, Pauline will be my mama now, which is a desperate survival mechanism.
Right.
But that mechanism sets a ticking time bomb, doesn't it? Because when Thérèse is around 9 or 10, Pauline leaves the house to enter the local Carmelite convent.
Which triggers a complete psychological collapse.
Oh, man.
Yeah, for Thérèse, Pauline entering a cloister wasn't just a sister moving out. To her traumatized nervous system, it was her mother dying a second time.
Wow.
The abandonment loop resets, but this time her body simply refuses to process the pain.
Let's talk about the physical manifestation of that, because
Yeah.
the medical accounts in our sources are terrifying. She suffers this quote-unquote strange sickness.
The symptoms are intense.
Yeah, the descriptions include severe nervous trembling, hallucinations, and periods where she physically doesn't even recognize her own sisters. The local doctors were completely baffled. Her father thought she was going to die.
It was incredibly grim.
Reading this with a modern lens, it reads like an extreme psychosomatic reaction, like a severe conversion disorder where emotional trauma literally short-circuits the nervous system.
It's a textbook case of the body keeping the score. I mean, the psychological distress was so profound that it hijacked her neurology. And her cure, according to her own autobiographical account, is equally fascinating.
Right, the statue.
Exactly. She's in bed suffering a severe attack. Her sisters are praying around her, and she looks at a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She writes, the statue suddenly became unutterably beautiful and smiled at her.
And just like that.
In that instant, the physical symptoms evaporate. Her nervous system completely resets.
But the tragedy of this moment is that the relief is immediately hijacked by her own anxiety.
Of course it is.
Because she's cured so suddenly, the adults around her start interrogating her. Like, what did you see? Did the statue move? How did she smile?
Which is the worst thing you could do to a neurotic kid.
Exactly. Thérèse, who is already highly anxious, suddenly feels like she might have exaggerated the whole thing. She feels like a fraud. And this plunges her right into a new, arguably worse psychological torment, which is the malady of scruples.
And scrupulosity is perhaps one of the most agonizing mental states a person can endure. To bridge this to modern psychology, scrupulosity is essentially a form of religious obsessive-compulsive disorder.
OCD.
Right. For a year and a half, Thérèse was trapped in a relentless cognitive distortion. Every single thought, every mundane action, every passing feeling was subjected to this intense paranoid scrutiny. She was terrified that she was constantly, inadvertently offending God.
Walk us through the mechanism of that, because I think people hear religious OCD and they picture someone just, praying a lot.
Right. They think it's just being very devout.
But the sources describe a paralyzing terror. What does that actually look like for her on a daily basis?
Imagine walking through a minefield where the mines are your own thoughts.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. If she felt a fleeting moment of pride about a school assignment, her brain would register that not as a normal childhood feeling, but as a mortal sin that severed her connection to the divine. The anxiety loop demands reassurance, which is the compulsion side of OCD.
Okay, so what was her compulsion?
She developed a complete dependency on her other older sister, Marie. Thérèse would confess every absurd, terrifying thought to Marie, literally begging for validation that she wasn't damned.
Oh, wow.
Marie would reassure her, Thérèse would feel a fleeting drop in anxiety, and then 10 minutes later, a new thought would trigger the cycle all over again.
It's the classic OCD reassurance trap. And it leaves her completely emotionally paralyzed. I mean, if she is this paralyzed by psychosomatic illness and obsessive anxiety, literally dependent on her sister to filter her reality, how does she possibly survive entering a strict cloistered convent?
Right, it seems impossible.
Something massive must have shifted her psychological baseline for her to even survive the application process.
And that brings us to one of the most heavily analyzed moments in her autobiography, which is Christmas 1886.
Yes. I was reading her account of this night, and she explicitly calls it her conversion. She says God did in one moment what she couldn't do in 10 years.
It's a dramatic claim.
But looking at the actual events, it seems almost trivial.
It really does on paper.
Right. She's 14. She comes home from midnight mass. There's this French tradition of leaving shoes by the fireplace for small gifts. Her father, Louis, is exhausted, sees the shoes, and mutters something sarcastic like, well, thankfully, this is the last year for this childishness.
Right.
That's it. That's the inciting incident.
To anyone else, it's a completely normal, slightly grumpy parental comment, but for Thérèse's hyper-fragile ecosystem, it should have been a devastating strike.
Complete meltdown.
Exactly. Her sister Celine actually blocks her on the stairs and says, don't go down there yet, take off your hat, wait until you've stopped crying. Celine fully anticipates the anxiety loop. Thérèse will realize she disappointed her father. She will weep, she will hate herself for weeping, and the night will be completely ruined.
But she doesn't.
No, she doesn't.
She forces down the tears, walks into the room with her heart pounding, and joyfully opens the gifts, putting on a brave face for her dad. From the outside, it just looks like a teenager finally deciding not to throw a tantrum.
So why does she view this as the defining theological and psychological shift of her life?
Because it represents a spontaneous, massive rewiring of her neuroplasticity.
Really? Just from that one moment?
Yes, in that split second on the stairs, she didn't just suppress a tear. She broke the 10-year cycle of hypersensitivity and self-obsession. She realized she had the internal agency to choose love for her father over her own emotional fragility.
Wow. She describes it as regaining the strength of soul she had lost at age 4.5. The paralysis of scrupulosity shattered. She calls it beginning to run a quote-unquote giant's course.
And the momentum of that giant's course is jarring. I mean, she immediately pivots from being entirely obsessed with her own internal purity to being obsessed with the outside world. She develops what she calls a thirst for souls.
A total shift in focus.
And the very first target of this new psychological strength is Henri Pranzini.
The contrast here is staggering.
It's wild.
You go from a girl who needs her sister's permission to feel okay about a passing thought to a teenager deciding she's going to spiritually battle for the soul of a notorious, unrepentant triple murderer.
Because Pranzini is facing the guillotine in Paris, right? He refuses to see a priest. He's mocking the whole process.
Yeah.
And Thérèse decides he is her first spiritual child.
She just claims him.
She prays for him relentlessly. She even asks for a sign. And the historical accounts of the execution corroborate her story. Right before the blade drops, Pranzini turns, grabs a crucifix from the attending priest, and kisses the wounds of Jesus 3 times.
And for Thérèse, this was absolute confirmation. It proved that her intervention, her prayers, had tangible cosmic weight. It fueled this audacious desire to enter the Carmelite convent immediately, to dedicate her entire life to this work.
Which leads to this incredible historical scene. The local superiors tell her she's too young at 15. The bishop says no. So her father takes her on a diocesan pilgrimage to Rome.
Right, as you do.
Naturally. And during a formal audience with Pope Leo XIII, where there is a strict rule of absolute silence, she breaks protocol. Our sources detail how she literally throws herself at the Pope's feet, grabs his knees, and begs for a papal dispensation to enter the convent.
It's unbelievable.
The Swiss guards have to physically pry her off the pontiff. Can you break down the cultural audacity of this? Like a 15-year-old middle-class French girl physically assaulting the knees of the Pope.
It demonstrates the complete synthesis of her childhood stubbornness with her new spiritual resilience. In 19th century Catholic culture, the Pope was an untouchable, almost imperial figure.
Right, you don't just chat with him.
Exactly. For a young girl to bypass the hierarchy of her prioress, her priest, and her bishop, and demand action directly from the Pope, it shows a profound, unshakable conviction that she was operating on a direct mandate from God.
The anxiety is just gone.
The anxiety that once paralyzed her has been completely transmuted into unstoppable forward momentum. She eventually wears down the opposition, and she enters Carmel.
So she wins the battle. She crosses the threshold into the cloister. The logical assumption is that she's finally in her element, ready to become the great, towering mystic she envisions.
That's what you'd think.
But instead of a smooth ascent, she hits an impenetrable wall. And this is where the theology of the little way is actually forged.
Exactly. The convent isn't a magical realm. It's a rigid, challenging environment. And it triggers a profound theological crisis.
She writes that she desires to be a great saint. But she looks at the heavyweights, like St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, the founders of her order, and she sees these towering, unscalable mountains of asceticism and mystical ecstasy.
The spiritual giants.
Right. Then she looks at herself, and she assesses her own capacity. She feels like an obscure grain of sand trampled underfoot. She knows with devastating clarity that she is psychologically and physically incapable of those grand, heroic feats.
And this is the moment where most people either abandon their ambition or dilute their ideal.
This makes sense.
Right. When the gap between your infinite desire and your microscopic capacity is that vast human nature dictates that you lower the bar, you say, well, I guess I'll just be an average, unremarkable nun.
But she rejects both options. She doesn't quit, and she refuses to compromise the scale of her ambition. Her logic here is fascinating. She deduces that God would not plant an infinite desire for sanctity in her heart if it were mathematically impossible for her to achieve it.
Such a logical leap.
It really is. Therefore, since she cannot climb the traditional mountain, there must be an alternative route specifically engineered for the small, the weak, and the utterly ordinary.
To fully appreciate how radical this alternative route was, we have to deeply understand the theological waters she was swimming in.
Oh, the Jansenism.
Right. 19th century French Catholicism was heavily infected by a movement called Jansenism.
I want to dig into this because our sources highlight Jansenism as the great antagonist to her philosophy. How did Jansenism actually dictate the daily life of a nun in her era?
Well, Jansenism was a deeply pessimistic, rigorous, and fear-based approach to theology. It emphasized human depravity and the absolute sternness of God's justice.
So a lot of guilt.
Immense guilt. In the Jansenist framework, God was a demanding auditor, constantly tallying your failures. Grace was incredibly rare, and you had to earn your way into God's tenuous favor through extreme self-denial, severe physical penance, and terror of damnation.
Wow.
It was a transactional, anxiety-inducing theology of climbing. You had to prove your worth.
Which sounds exactly like the engine that drove her scrupulosity in her childhood. She'd internalized that terrifying auditor God.
Exactly. She had lived that terror.
So when she is faced with her inability to climb the rough stairway of perfection, she isn't just admitting physical weakness. She is actively dismantling the prevailing Jansenist framework of her culture.
Precisely. She realizes that trying to earn her way up the stairs is a fool's errand, and she finds her solution not in a theological textbook, but in a brilliant metaphor drawn from the cutting-edge technology of the Industrial Revolution.
The elevator.
The elevator.
The imagery is so striking. I mean, the Eiffel Tower had just been built. Elevators were these miraculous new contraptions replacing the grueling, sweaty climb of thousands of stairs. Thérèse writes that she is too small to climb the stairs to heaven, so she needs a spiritual elevator to lift her.
She searches the Hebrew scriptures, specifically Proverbs and Isaiah, and she locks onto imagery of God as a mother carrying a small child on her lap, comforting and caressing them.
And the synthesis she arrives at is the core of the little way. The elevator is the arms of Jesus. She realizes she does not need to grow up. She doesn't need to bulk up her spiritual muscles to conquer the mountain.
Which would just be ego anyway.
Right, doing so would just feed her ego. Instead, she needs to remain little and deliberately become smaller. By acknowledging her absolute inability to climb, she forces God's mercy to do the heavy lifting.
It is a complete theological inversion.
It's brilliant.
Under Jansenism, God demands you become a giant. Under the little way, God demands you accept your status as an infant. It is a theology of radical, absolute surrender, replacing a theology of willpower and achievement. She recognized that her weakness wasn't a disqualification from greatness. It was the exact mechanism that attracted God's intervention.
It's a beautiful paradigm shift, but I want to introduce some friction here, because an idea like just be a child in the elevator of God's arms sounds lovely in a journal, but she is living in a highly regimented, claustrophobic community of a few dozen women scrubbing floors and washing clothes.
The reality of convent life.
Right. How does this philosophy actually survive contact with reality? This brings us to her discovery of her vocation and her rejection of heroic penance.
Because philosophy without application is just poetry. Thérèse had to operationalize the little way in the mundane grind of the cloister.
And initially she struggles with this. She reads the letters of St. Paul, specifically his breakdown of the different roles in the church, apostles, prophets, teachers. And her infinite desires flare up again.
She wants to do it all.
She writes that she wants to be a warrior, a crusader, a priest, a martyr. She wants to preach the gospel in all corners of the earth simultaneously. She has this agonizing realization that her desires are cosmic, but her reality is confined to a few square acres in Normandy.
That cognitive dissonance is agonizing. She is searching for her function. But as she rereads St. Paul's analogy of the church as a body, she has a profound epiphany.
About the heart.
Yes. She realizes that if the church is a body, it isn't just comprised of the active limbs, the hands building hospitals, the feet traveling to mission territories. It must have a central organ. It must have a heart. And that heart must be burning with love, pumping life to all the other extremities.
She famously cries out, "My vocation is love." She decides her job is to simply be the heart. But wait, I have to challenge the mechanics of this. She decides she's going to be love. But she isn't out in the streets of Paris feeding the poor or stopping wars. She's locked inside.
Sure.
Isn't there a danger here that her little way is just a spiritualized excuse for doing nothing? How does she actually perform this vocation without it just being an invisible internal feeling?
That is the crucial question, and it's where we see the intense psychological rigor of her method. To understand how she practiced love, we have to contrast it with the traditional monastic concept of heroic penance.
Okay, let's contrast it.
In the 19th century cloister, serious nuns pursued holiness through intense bodily mortification. We're talking wearing hair shirts, brutal fasting, sleeping on boards, self-flagellation.
Punishing the physical body to discipline the soul.
Right. But Therese's superiors, noting her frail health, forbade her from taking on these extreme physical penances. And Thérèse realized something incredibly perceptive about human psychology. Extreme physical penance can very easily become a vehicle for intense narcissism.
Oh, wow. Like spiritual ego lifting. Look how holy I am. I bleed more than you.
Exactly. You can secretly pride yourself on your ascetic endurance. You build an identity around your suffering. Thérèse bypasses the physical body and targets the actual root of the problem. She focuses entirely on mortifying her self-love.
Her ego.
Her ego. And she does this through microscopic, relentlessly intentional acts of invisible charity. It's remarkably similar to the disciplines found in modern Stoicism or cognitive behavioral therapy.
Let's ground this in the specific examples from the source material because they're brilliantly relatable. She talks about deliberately choosing not to lean her back against the support when seated.
Just a tiny physical discipline.
Right, that no one else would ever notice.
Right.
Or taking the time to carefully fold the cloaks that other, more careless nuns had left discarded around the convent.
Those are the physical disciplines, but the interpersonal disciplines are where the little way becomes truly demanding.
Yes, the dirty laundry incident.
A classic.
She's assigned to the laundry room, washing clothes in a trough opposite another nun. And this other nun is careless, aggressively scrubbing, and repeatedly splashing dirty, soapy water right into Therese's face. Now, if we talk about mortifying the ego, isn't there a fine line between mortifying your ego and just being a pushover?
It can look that way from the outside.
Why doesn't she just say, "Sister, please watch the water"? How is letting someone splash you an act of profound love and not just weakness?
Because of the internal cognitive reframing she applies. If she reacts with anger or even polite correction, she is prioritizing her own comfort and validating her ego's demand for respect.
Right.
If she simply stews in silent resentment, she is becoming a victim. Thérèse does neither. She actively intercepts the physiological response of frustration and reframes it. She decides to mentally treat every splash of dirty water as if it were a priceless treasure being tossed to her.
That is wild.
She doesn't just tolerate the water, she actively desires to accept it joyfully as a secret offering to God. It requires supreme emotional regulation. It is the absolute annihilation of the reflex to defend oneself.
That reframing is incredible. It takes so much more psychological energy to genuinely reframe an annoyance into a joy than it does to just snap at someone. And that brings us to my absolute favorite example from her writings, the clicking teeth.
The ultimate test of the little way in the wild.
Right. Thérèse is in the chapel for the hour of silent, contemplative prayer. It's supposed to be the most peaceful part of the day. But the nun sitting directly behind her has a habit of making a terrible, repetitive clicking or scraping noise.
It's just awful.
Thérèse isn't sure if it's the nun's teeth or her rosary beads against her teeth, but it is incessant. Thérèse, with her hypersensitive nervous system, is being driven absolutely insane. She writes that she is literally sweating with the physical effort to ignore the noise.
And anyone who understands the psychology of hyperfixation knows that trying to ignore a repetitive noise only amplifies it. The brain zeroes in on the irritant.
Exactly. We've all been trapped on an airplane or in a quiet office with someone making that noise. The instinct is murderous.
Truly.
So what does Thérèse do? She knows that turning around and glaring would break the rule of silence and shame the other nun. She knows she can't block it out, so she leans into it.
She flips the script.
She takes all that frantic, irritated mental energy and deliberately forces her brain to interpret that annoying clicking noise as a delightful concert. She takes the irritation, packages it as a beautiful symphony, and offers it to God.
Think about the mechanics of what she is doing. She is stripping away her ego completely. There's absolutely no glory in this. If you wear a hair shirt, people might suspect you are a hardcore ascetic.
They might whisper about how holy you are.
Right. But if you endure a clicking noise without complaining, nobody knows. Nobody praises you. It requires absolute, invisible, uncelebrated charity. She refuses to be the hero of the story.
She uses another analogy to describe this posture. She calls herself the little brush. She envisions God as a master artist painting a massive masterpiece. The great saints, the Pauls, the Augustines, the Theresas of Avila, they are the big, sweeping brushes laying down the bold colors and defining the landscape.
The major players.
But Thérèse says she is just the tiny, microscopic brush the artist uses to fill in the absolute smallest, unnoticeable details in the background. She finds immense liberating joy in being that uncelebrated instrument.
It's a complete subversion of the hero narrative that dominates both religious and secular ambition. She proves that profound impact doesn't require a large stage. It requires immense intentionality in the smallest spaces.
It is a beautiful, deeply peaceful philosophy. But it's relatively easy to be the little brush when you're just dealing with annoying coworkers and laundry water.
It's true, the stakes are low.
The true test of any philosophy is what happens when the floor drops out. Which brings us to the final and most harrowing chapter of her life, the night of faith.
This is where the story shifts from a beautiful spiritual framework into a profound existential crucible. If the little way was just a psychological coping mechanism, this is where it would have shattered.
It begins on Good Friday, 1896. Thérèse goes to sleep, and in the middle of the night, she feels a bubbling sensation in her throat. She coughs, holds her handkerchief up to the small oil lamp, and sees that it is covered in bright arterial blood.
A horrifying moment.
It is the undeniable physical sign of advanced pulmonary tuberculosis. In 1896, this is an absolute agonizing death sentence.
And we must note her immediate psychological reaction. She writes that she welcomed the blood with profound joy.
Joy.
Yes, she genuinely believed this was the signal that her exile on earth was ending. She had spent her life cultivating this intense desire for heaven, to be in the elevator of God's arms, and she thought she was finally arriving at the destination.
But then, almost instantly, a thick, suffocating darkness descends. Suddenly, all of her spiritual joy, all that warm certainty she had felt since her Christmas conversion, evaporates entirely.
She enters a state that mystical theology refers to as the dark night of the soul, or the trial of faith. But Thérèse's experience of it is uniquely modern in its bleakness.
No.
She is plunged into a dense psychological darkness where she feels that heaven is completely closed to her. She writes that a wall has been erected between her and the sky. She is tormented by intrusive thoughts telling her that her entire life has been a fairy tale, that there is no heaven, and that only the night of nothingness awaits her after she finishes suffocating.
I have to push back hard on this outcome because it feels incredibly jarring, almost cruel.
It does.
She spends her entire conscious life cultivating this absolute trust. She builds this intricate framework of being a child sitting on God's lap, and at the very end, when she is dying a horrific physical death and needs that comfort the most, she feels absolutely nothing. She feels like God doesn't exist. Isn't that a catastrophic tragedy? Did her psychological framework, her little way, ultimately fail her when the pressure peaked?
It's the most natural question to ask, and it's why her writings resonate so deeply with modern secular audiences. But if we deeply analyze her response to this void, we see that it isn't the failure of the little way. It is its absolute staggering culmination.
Wait, how could feeling abandoned be the culmination of a theology of love?
Because the entire premise of the little way is the annihilation of self-interest. Up until this point, her love for God was accompanied by immense spiritual consolation. It felt good to love God.
She got something out of it.
Exactly. She enjoyed the emotional warmth of trusting him. She loved the thought of heaven. But in this darkness, the feeling of faith is entirely stripped away. The emotional reward is gone.
So she is left with just the raw choice.
Exactly. She is forced to act out of love purely as an act of the will. She writes a profound phrase during this time. She says she is sitting at the table of sinners.
The table of sinners. Unpack what she means by that.
She means those who do not believe. Atheists, secularists, those who have lost their faith or never had it. In the 19th century, the church viewed non-believers as adversaries to be defeated or pitied.
Right, outsiders.
Thérèse, however, experiences absolute visceral solidarity with them. She is eating the same bitter bread of meaninglessness. She looks at death and sees the exact same black void they see. But, and this is the genius of her final days, she continues to execute the little way. She continues to love, to smile at her sisters, to hide her pain, not because she feels the warmth of God, but despite feeling nothing at all.
She is loving purely for the sake of love, with absolutely zero expectation of a return on investment, not even the comfort of a peaceful deathbed.
It is the ultimate selfless act. She proves that her love was not transactional.
And we cannot overstate the physical horror she is enduring while maintaining this internal discipline. She has tuberculosis of the lungs, which eventually spreads to her intestines.
It's incredibly gruesome.
Her bones are protruding. She can barely draw a breath. She describes the pain as feeling like she is stretched out on iron spikes. The medical reality of her death is brutal.
Yet her discipline holds. The sisters of the convent are constantly around her bed recording her last words, which is a whole other level of psychological pressure, having an audience wait for you to say something profound while you suffocate. But she focuses entirely on comforting them.
There is a moment recorded in our sources where she is in absolute agony, and she reflects on her own writings. She notes that everything she had written about her desire for suffering, her desire to offer herself completely, was true. Even facing the void, even in the center of the pain, she does not regret surrendering to love. She stands entirely by her philosophy.
The child who once wept because someone looked at her sideways was now enduring a torturous death while comforting her caretakers, all while trapped in a psychological void. The giant's course was complete.
It culminates on September 30th, 1897. She is 24 years old. The sources describe her final moments. She is gasping for air. She looks at the crucifix she is holding, and her final words are simply, "My God, I love you." And then she dies.
And the paradox is sealed. She died feeling completely empty, surrounded by darkness, utterly convinced she was an insignificant grain of sand whose life would be forgotten.
But she wasn't.
No, within a few years, her unvarnished, deeply honest writings about her darkness, her anxiety, and her relentless commitment to love in the mundane details would blanket the globe. She was canonized incredibly quickly, precisely because her struggles were so universally human.
So we've traced this incredible arc. We started with a highly sensitive, deeply traumatized child in Alençon who was paralyzed by anxiety and a fear-based theology. We've seen how she actively dismantled that fear, bypassing the demand for heroic, ego-driven achievements.
Right.
She engineered the little way, utilizing the cognitive reframing of the elevator and the little brush to transform microscopic, annoying daily interactions into profound acts of will. And she proved the absolute durability of that framework by maintaining it even when plunged into the total existential darkness of her final illness.
She permanently shifted the metric of human greatness. She detached it from scale, from what we achieve, and attached it entirely to the intentionality of how we love in the smallest, most invisible things.
And this is where we bring the source material directly to you, the listener. Because we are currently living in a cultural moment that is aggressively obsessed with scale and optimization.
Oh, totally.
We are told constantly to build our brand, to maximize our impact, to climb the corporate ladder, to be the main character, to hustle until we are recognized.
We are surrounded by a secularized Jansenism. It's no longer about earning God's favor through hair shirts. It's about earning society's favor through relentless productivity and visible achievement. We are terrified of being ordinary.
Thérèse's philosophy violently flips that script. She looks at our modern anxiety about being enough and suggests that true, enduring greatness might not be found in the promotion, the viral post, or the massive project. It might actually be found in the exact places we are trying to escape. It's found in the extreme emotional regulation required to handle an annoying coworker. It's found in how you approach a tedious, unglamorous daily chore. It's found in how you choose to act in a moment of total obscurity, when no one is watching, no one will ever applaud you, and there is zero return on your emotional investment.
The Little Way insists that feeling like a microscopic grain of sand isn't a disqualification from a meaningful life. Recognizing your smallness is the exact prerequisite for letting something larger lift you.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as you step back into your day. If the Little Way demands that we stop trying to be the towering hero of our own grand narrative and instead actively choose to become the invisible little brush in the background, what is one mundane, intensely frustrating part of your routine, a chore, an irritating relationship, a clicking noise that you are currently desperate to escape, which might actually be the exact elevator you've been looking for?
It completely changes the stakes of an ordinary Tuesday.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning your frameworks, keep looking for the profound in the ordinary, and we'll catch you next time.